Hi there. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Bonfilio, EDF Action's president, and I'm excited that you're joining us for our second political science event, Strengthening the Democratic Process to Make Climate Progress. We have an incredible panel, and before we get to them, I just want to kick us off by talking about voting for just a few minutes at the top. Now, most of us haven't had an election to care about for a few months now. Yet voting access and voting are top of mind as we hear from states across the country that are passing bills to restrict access to the polls and suppress the vote. Today, you'll hear our panelists as they discuss the impact that these efforts may have both on our democracy and what that may mean for environmental progress now and into the future. We at EDF Action have really started to focus in on this issue because who has access to the polls, who is voting is so critically important for us as we work to elect climate champions and allies both in Washington, D.C. and in state houses across the country. Our goal to do just that, to work to back these environmental champions so they can work on pro-climate and pro-environmental legislation gets harder as states restrict access to the polls. We believe that voting is so fundamental to our work and our system of government that these efforts to work against that work against us. We believe the exact opposite, that we should be expanding access to the polls. We should make it easier for folks to be registered, for folks to choose when they go vote. Because we know when we expand the electorate, those folks that come to join our efforts, to join these efforts, both support climate action and are going to push politicians to be better and do better. Climate progress depends not only on a working democracy, but a thriving one. So let's dig in with our experts today and figure out how to do just that. Thank you again for joining us. And now I'll turn it over to our host, Margot Brown.
Hello, everyone. I'm Margot Brown, the Associate Vice President for Environmental Justice at the Environmental Defense Fund, and I'm delighted to be here with you all to talk about this critically important topic. As we all know, efforts to disenfranchise or suppress voters are not new or unusual, and these efforts threaten climate action. This year, 47 states have introduced a total of more than 360 bills to restrict access to the polls, and 5 have already been signed into law. These bills include restrictions that place limits on mail-in voting and ban drop boxes. Most voters who are worried about climate change and also support comprehensive action to tackle the challenge head-on are also very concerned about these voting restrictions. And the hurdles that have been put in place to make voting harder for people to use their collective voice and to elect candidates who will fight for pro-environmental legislation. Right now, communities face a lot of barriers to voting, and those communities are also far more likely to live near a Superfund site and to face severe environmental hazards that impact their air, water, and soil. These residents also in these communities need competent political representation in order to protect their health, and they cannot achieve that without access to voting. Before we get started this afternoon, I'd really like to just go over a few housekeeping issues. If you have a question at any time during our conversation, please use the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen to ask your question, and we'll be sure to add it into the queue. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to who you'll hear from today. We've got a great panel, and I'm excited to introduce them all. You will be hearing from Tanya Calhoun. She is the National Field Director for EDF's sister organization, Moms Clean Air Force. You'll also be hearing from Alex Gulata, the Arizona State Director and Acting National Director for All Voting is Local, and Dan Weiner, the Deputy Director of Election Reform at the Brennan Center. Tanya, Alex, and Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to jump right into some of the questions because there's so much to cover and so little time. And I want to make sure that we get as much of your thoughts as possible. So to start us off, the very first question I have for you, for all three of you, is what does voter suppression look like to you in the 21st century? And what can we do to tackle it? Dan, I'm going to kick it over to you first.
Sure. Well, first of all, it is such a pleasure to be here today. And I have just huge admiration and respect for the work that EDF does. And obviously, the stakes couldn't be higher. So it's really a pleasure. To answer your question, I guess I would say voter suppression in the 21st century doesn't look all that different from what it looked like in the 20th century. We literally have state legislatures talking about, quote, the purity of the ballot box, which, folks may know is a very dark phrase that really dates back, frankly, to the end of Reconstruction and how folks used to talk about wanting to exclude people of color from the franchise. And I think it's important to remember that most Jim Crow voter suppression laws were facially neutral. They did not exclude people by race. There was sometimes blatantly discriminatory enforcement, but very often, like today, they relied on fundamental systemic inequalities, a poll tax that most people of color in the South could not pay, whereas middle-class white voters could pay. So in that sense, it's obviously subtler today, and I'm not trying to say it's the exact same thing, but categorically, when you have, more than 1,500 polling places closed in states that were formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act until the Shelby County decision, when you have purge practices that, pretty explicitly target communities of color disproportionately, when you have a voter ID law in North Dakota that requires someone to have an address when they knew Native communities often do not have ID with an address, I really don't think that there is that big a difference. And the last point I would have to say is, that we only are not just worried about state-sponsored voter suppression, but we are also worried about private vigilantism and disinformation. And that is one thing that is new here, because with the advent of the internet, these tactics have become much more harmful, both in terms of spreading the messages that people have to suppress the vote and also organizing for vote suppressors. What we should do about it, obviously, is the subject of today's discussion, legislation, but I'll stop there and let my co-panelists jump in.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And much like Daniel, I'm so excited to be here and be a part of this conversation. I'm just going to piggyback off of Dan. Voter suppression in the 21st century, it has become more insidious than in the past. Here in Georgia, Senate Bill 202 is a bill with voter suppression at the heart of it. We saw all the headlines, how Georgia bans giving out water and food to voters waiting in long lines, but it does so much more. It puts up unnecessary roadblocks that hurt people of color, young voters, and voters with disabilities. It requires a voter ID that Dan mentioned for absentee voting. It requires mailing sensitive documentation like your social security number to request and send the ballot back. And also under this bill, drop boxes are only allowed at early voting locations and only open during voting hours. And this inherently cuts down the locations in minority and low-income communities. And these limiting hours, it defeats the purpose of drop boxes for those who choose to utilize this option, because of their work schedules, I should say. I spoke to an 83-year-old woman in rural Georgia. She has never had a driver's license. She cannot find her birth certificate, and she doesn't know where her social security card might be. Now, is she concerned about voting? Yes, absolutely. But does she want to incur the expenses and the inconveniences to obtain this documentation to do so? Not really, y'all. But her vote should still count. Getting a valid ID will require waiving the cost of the ID itself, but it requires the documentation, the time taken off from work to wait in these long lines, the access to transportation. And these are things that everyone has the luxury of so they can vote. And additionally, in some of these licensing offices in predominantly Black and rural counties, they are only open 2 days a week. I'm going to repeat that, 2 days a week. And in my communication with fellow voters, the ease of voting during this past year was what made their 2020 voting experience so meaningful and convenient. And, you know, only the few portions of the bill that I've mentioned are terrible on their own, but there's much more in the bill and all the ways that voters will be suppressed that makes it the most restrictive, or I should say one of the most restrictive laws in the nation. And these aren't just words on a page. Each, you know, provision, it impacts real people with real consequences. You know, just thinking about my very own environmental advocacy work, limiting, you know, access to the poll means that individuals like myself who believe in science and climate change, we can end up with representation that doesn't care about the climate crisis or the impacts of toxic water. And Margot, like you mentioned, the air pollution, what it has on our lives and communities now and in the future. So we need to push democracy reform now more than ever. It will ensure our communities continue to have the voice in the political process. Our democracy should be empowering our voters here in Georgia, not suppressing them. You know, as long as we have this mentality and this race to restricting voting access, these voting inequities will persist, and so will our environmental injustices. So I appreciate this, and I'm going to kick it over to Alex.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here today too, and appreciate your letting me join in. You know, I think we all come from a background where we believe that, like, for democracy to work for all of us, it needs to work, it needs to include all of us, right? It needs to be inclusive. And throughout history, we've fought to, like, ensure that Americans have the right to vote honored, and that every eligible American is able to cast their vote and have that vote be counted. I think what we're seeing are unprecedented attacks on two levels, right? So it is a continuation of a history, but it's on steroids right now, and in two levels, right? One is who gets to vote. There are concerted attacks on access to voting that hurt all voters, but they disproportionately impact communities of color in almost every circumstance, right? And so less people will be able to vote, less votes will be counted because we're attacking vote by mail, we're reducing early voting, we're putting restrictions on which ballots are cast or counted, and it's systematic. It's not just happening in Arizona, it's happening in Georgia, it's happening in Florida, it's happening in Pennsylvania, right? It's a concerted plan to reduce access to voting. But the second thing is, it's who gets to decide our elections, right? It's who has the power, the ultimate power to decide. It's replacing partisan legislative bodies for objective election officials and who the ultimate decision makers are. If you look at what's going on with this audit in Arizona, it's just a test run for what's going to come in the future. This is happening after the election. But what would have happened if the Arizona Senate had, before the results had been certified, subpoenaed all those ballots, right? And interjected itself into the determination of the outcome of the election. And we're seeing power grabs like that. There were bills in many states that basically said that the legislature could replace the judgment of the voters in terms of who decided who won the election, right? Without standards, without a basis for doing that. And that is incredibly dangerous. And so I think there are these two levels, and we need to, like, think of them both and focus on them both. It's individual voters are being excluded, and that's disproportionately impacting voters of color, but it's the power to make decisions, the validity of our elections, the sanctity of election officials' certification that this is who won is also under attack. And that's yet another level of problem that we need to factor in, and we really need to be fighting back against.
Thank you all for setting the stage for today's conversation. Dan, I'd like to start with you. I have a follow-up question. Can you explain more and a lot greater detail here what Congress' role should be in an election and how their efforts to standardize elections can help?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with a quick story, which is that I used to work at the Federal Election Commission, which is our national campaign finance regulator. actually. And we used to get delegations coming in from other countries, and they would ask us, how does the US election system work? And we would sit there and we would say, well, you know, there are about 1,000 different local officials, some of them partisan, and they each kind of just run their own election and, you know, they work it out. And it was always someone from Scandinavia whose eyes would be as wide as dinner plates. And they would sort of be like, but you can't do that. And we would always sort of say, well, that's how it works. Anyway, move along, have a cookie. And so what that points to, right, is that the US election system is far more decentralized than our other peer democracies. And that does have some benefits, right? It's flexibility, the diffusion of power. But as Alex's comments pointed out, obviously, there are also some problems, and we're seeing that more around the country. So while and in fact, the Constitution recognizes this problem. Our default is that the states run elections, but it says explicitly Congress may set the rules for federal elections if it doesn't like what the states do. That is in the language of the Constitution. Even very conservative justices have made that very clear, and Congress has in fact done that many, many times. The National Voter Registration Act, the Voting Rights Act. It is not unusual for Congress to come in, displace the states, and set minimum baselines. And, you know, what I really think is the appropriate balance is that, yes, state and local officials should run the elections. And we saw tremendous courage on behalf of many state and local officials who pushed back against the effort to overturn the election result. But it is entirely appropriate for Congress to set the minimum standards, particularly for voting access. And that's essentially what the legislation that we're talking about, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act do, is they set those standards for access to the ballot. And that's what I think that is what we were saying, because there has to be some sort of federal guarantee. The courts are not going to step in, but they have explicitly conceded that Congress has the power to do that.
Thank you so much. Tanya, I'm going to follow up with you next. How do you see your work in the environmental space connect with ensuring access to the polls?
Thank you, Margot. You know, I want real and lasting climate action. So at Moms Clean Air Force, you know, we pride ourselves on fighting for justice in every breath. So what does that mean? You know, we recognize that climate change is a threat to everyone, but we also know the effects of climate change are not equally felt. You know, communities of color and low-income communities are hit first and worst by climate change and air and water pollution. You know, just last year, we saw flooding, we saw wildfires, we saw extreme weather events that have further impacted our climate. And so, you know, as these communities grapple with even more harmful effects of climate change, they now have to concern themselves with very real voter suppression tactics that keep them from voicing these same issues. And so, you know, the harder it is to vote, the more power is drained from communities, unfortunately. And so, you know, in order to achieve this lasting climate action that I'm so avid about, we need free and fair elections. Democracy is the best tool that we have to protect our environment. It's our environment, but it's got to work properly. You know, I would say a healthy, functioning democracy means that decision makers represent the people and not the big polluter interests. We cannot act, you know, in a meaningful way, if you will, without a thriving democracy. We know that. And this is where the power of the people have the real say in our candidates and in our legislation. And so in order to elect these candidates who represent our interests, we have to act on climate. Or I should say, who act on climate. Every eligible voter should be able to vote. And for me, you know, I want to be a part of ensuring that voting is safe, that is accessible, to further fight a cleaner future for everyone. So.
Thank you. Alex, you mentioned sort of your two big areas, and I'd like to focus a little bit more on what you said. What is the most concerning part about state laws like you've seen in Arizona, and what impact might voters see, particularly voters of color?
Yeah, I think so. I think the effects are twofold. at a operational level, it's just going to be harder to vote as things are passed that just create barriers. And different people have different abilities to sustain that burden, right? You know, I've heard the number of legislators I've heard stand up and say, like, well, if you can't get to the polls on election day, like, you're not really an American. But no, you may actually be just a person that has 2 jobs and small kids. And that's why we have vote by mail. That's why vote by mail has become so popular. That's why these conveniences, they're actually like, they're democracy, right? It's like we've been making our elections more democratic by spreading out how long you can vote and what days you can vote on and the places you can vote and the methods that you can use to vote. And the result of that was unprecedented turnout. And there are people who don't like that. Okay, it's that simple. They don't like that there's unprecedented turnout, and so then there are just bills that just chip away at that. And like in some places in Georgia, that's an omnibus bill that has 1,000 provisions. In Arizona, it's 50 different bills that all basically are all doing the same thing, but they're chipping away at it in a different method, right? Like the legislative tactic is different, but the essential drive about what they're trying to accomplish is the same, and that is to make it harder to vote. So, you know, the Navajo Nation entered a settlement after the 2018 election that basically said, we have many people who speak Navajo and who need language assistance, and if they fail to sign their ballot, we should give them an opportunity to cure their ballot. There was a question in Arizona law whether or not an unsigned ballot could be cured after Election Day. And so they entered into a settlement with the Secretary of State's office so that they could basically make sure that those ballots could be cured. Our state legislature just passed a law that makes that illegal. Okay, like they could say all they want that wasn't targeting Native American voters, but it specifically undermines a settlement for Native American voters specifically targeted to be able to help Navajo speakers who failed to sign their ballot because they weren't given adequate instructions in the language that they speak. And so like that's just like one example, but there are many, many, many examples like that are just like very, very, very targeted, and the impact they know is going to be on all voters, but the disproportionate impact is going to be on voters of color. And that's the point. It's not a bug, it's a feature, and it's being pushed in a way that really hurts communities of color. I think the second layer is the whole ability to like undermine the sanctity of the election and whether or not we should even trust the results of the election. That impacts all of us at a huge level, and it's being done in a way that in states where the legislature thinks they can do a better job than the people in deciding how elections should be determined, and we just need to be fighting back at that on a national level. Our governor got up and yesterday signed a bill that kicks at least 100, maybe more, 1,000 people off of our 100,000. Maybe more people off of our permanent early voting list. And as part of that, he like scolded corporations for like stepping in where they shouldn't have because some corporations spoke out. I would say, wow, he has it so wrong. Like we need those corporations to step up. We need businesses to step up because the undemocratic principles that are being pushed are damaging to democracy writ large. And we need our businesses to actually stand up for that because they will do less well if we lose our democracy. And we're really at risk of doing that with some of these things that we're engaging in that undermine elections. And this audit, which we can, if people want to talk about it later in Arizona, it's just a test. It's a test run toward undermining elections, and everyone should be really concerned about it.
Thank you so much, Alex. Dan, building on what Alex and Tanya have described, can you explain to everyone here today why we need to pass both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Advancement Act to ensure voting access? And the second part of that question is, what does one do that the other does not do? And why do we need both?
Sure. Well, first of all, I completely agree with what Alex just said. And I think that voting access is a huge part of solving both problems, frankly, particularly though the sort of discriminatory trying to keep people away from the ballot box. And I think that the best way to think about these two bills is as kind of as bookends. So the For the People Act sets a sort of baseline standard of voting access for everyone. I mean, not, these are benefits for everyone. And in fact, we can talk about this later. Many of the things in the For the People Act have broad bipartisan support, were passed in very red states. So things like modernizing voter registration and making it automatic. So when you interact with the DMV, you get registered to vote unless you opt out. Voting accessibility, obviously, vote by mail, also early voting. These are things that states have been doing for decades. They're sort of common sense solutions. Critically, restoring the rights of formerly incarcerated people to vote. That's actually one of the last explicit Jim Crow relics is the ban on people who've been incarcerated from voting. And I really want to emphasize that these are things that benefit everyone, but they do have a disproportionate benefit for communities of color and other marginalized communities. I think it's important to remember it also benefits younger voters, right? Who, for instance, are more targeted by voter purges. So then the John Lewis Act plays a different but no less important role. And that's because the Voting Rights Act is less about prohibiting or requiring specific practices than it is about the inquiry about whether a change to voting laws was intended for discriminatory reasons and has a discriminatory impact. The Constitution itself provides some protection against that, as does Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, but the crown jewel of the system was this pre-clearance process, where jurisdictions that had a history of voting discrimination had to get voting changes pre-cleared with the federal government before they could make those changes. So it prevents, and I heard Barbara Arnwine, the former leadership of the president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, put it this way: it prevents the shenanigans on the back end. And what the John Lewis Act does is it takes that pre-clearance system and it modernizes it to deal with our 21st century problems. And one way it does that actually is that instead of just focusing on specific jurisdictions, it also focuses to a greater extent on specific practices like purges, also in-person ID requirements that we just know are shot through with discrimination. Whether that's because of a desire to discriminate on the basis of race, whether it's because of partisanship, and then the assumption that certain people vote a certain way, those are often hard to disaggregate. It just, subjects these practices and then certain jurisdictions to additional scrutiny. So you really need both, because Congress can't think of everything. And there may be certain practices that are, fine in one context, but really not in another. And it's that kind of two-part structure that we really need to ensure that everyone has access to the ballot.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Before I put my next question to Alex, for those of you who have a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit it, and we'll add your questions to the queue. I'm going to kick my next question back to Alex. Alex, Southern states are denying that they are trying to restrict voting rights in Black communities. Can you talk about the history of Latino and Native disenfranchisement in Arizona?
Yeah, I mean, just on the point of what the intent is, it doesn't actually matter, because in fact, we see what the impact is, right? Because we have this argument every day. As a matter of fact, I've seen on the floor of the Arizona Senate where somebody calls a point of order because you're impugning my integrity because you're saying I'm, engaging in racist conduct. It's I don't need to say what your intent is, because here's the data, right? We actually know who gets harmed by these things. We can show who uses the various conveniences that we've created that make voting easier, and most of the practices, like the example I used from the Navajo Nation, we can trace back to they have a disparate impact, right? So just, to be fair, right? But I think every state has its own unique history of how we discriminate against voters. The history in Arizona is more around Latino voters and around Native American voters. Native American voters, weren't really enfranchised first in the 40s. There have been a number of lawsuits and it was really the 70s before Native American voters in Arizona really had access to the ballot box in a meaningful way. And in the Native American community is like a subset. It's 4 or 5% of our total population. But when you think of, that's a lot in our state, and it's a lot of Native Americans. And the practices in terms of how tribes interact with governmental officials are complicated, right? Like, tribes are sovereign nations. Like this cycle, for example, the complexities around COVID, there were many tribes that had lockdown orders. The Navajo Nation for a period of time was the most infected area in the world for a period of time per capita. Yet Native American voting increased 8.5% or almost 9% in Arizona. Turnout increased amongst Native Americans. And so that's a big number just in an abstract form, but considering COVID, considering there were periods of time in August or September where we didn't even know whether people could go on the Navajo Nation to conduct the elections, the fact that we increased Native American voting by almost 9% in Arizona this cycle is it's amazing, right? So I think I've strayed from your question a little, but the point is delivering services to a community like the Navajo Nation is complex, right? Like, I don't have to it's a very rural area. There's almost no internet access in large, there's not even phone coverage in large, it's a very rural area. It is a very low income area. The resources, it's a very resource poor area. And in terms of just economics, and being able to deliver elections and have that community engaged sometimes requires that we do more. Vote by mail doesn't work in rural areas on the Navajo Nation largely, because in the rest of Arizona, 96% of people have a U.S. Postal Service, are on a mail route. 26% of Native Americans are. 96, 26, right? So to the degree vote by mail has been a great solution, it is, it's great, but it is not particularly a solution for that community. Like the disability access community also talks about this a lot, right? It's that's another area where vote by mail may not be the right choice, right? And so vote by mail is a good thing. We want to encourage it. On the other hand, there are always communities that are going to need that kind of extra effort on our part to be able to deliver high quality voting services. And we just need to be aware of that. The Navajo Nation, disability rights communities, other communities are places where we need to be thoughtful about that.
Thank you, Alex. We have a question that's come in, and I'm going to throw this to the entire panel. You can answer in any way you see fit. What does support look like from organizations to help combat the disenfranchisement that you've all described? And more specifically, in terms of helping get people to the polls or get them the proper documentation that's needed. For example, Tanya, you provided a really awesome explanation of an 83-year-old woman in rural Georgia. So kicking that question to the panel.
I'll jump in. So I just spoke, so I'll be brief. But I mean, there are just tons of things around election administration where we can just make huge differences, right? Like part of what we do at All Voting is Local is really work on election administration advocacy. And so no matter what the law passed by the state legislature is, it has to be implemented. And there are 1,000 tactical choices about how laws are implemented that impact how effective they are and whether or not they're more or less exclusive. And so, you know, finding ways, like, you know, we have an election procedures manual in Arizona. It's being revised this year. It's required to be revised. It's basically like the regulations that control our elections. And so, like, having input into that process, last cycle we were able to get a provision added that basically said that folks who were jailed, who were eligible to vote, who the reason they couldn't vote was because they couldn't get out of jail to go vote because they were either misdemeanors is the reason they were in jail, or because they were just accused of a crime and couldn't post cash bond, right? There are many people in jail who have a right to vote, but there were no procedures. There was no process for people to actually be able to do that. And having our Secretary of State include in the manual, election officials, you need to work with sheriffs and create a process. Like, there are people who are being disenfranchised, you need to like create a process. And so like, that's like one example of thousands where concerned citizens and other folks can really like impact how elections are managed by working on the administration of elections. And I would encourage folks to look through where are the opportunities now. You know, Arizona's going to pass this law, Georgia's going to pass that law, but then there's implementation, and there are huge gains that can be made in terms of how things are implemented that will make them less burdensome or mitigate the harm, if you will.
You know, I'll just piggyback off of what Alex really just said. You know, since the election, I personally have continued to work with Fair Fight. And so, you know, a couple of the things that they are empowering us to do is to take action to like fully understand, like what Alex was just mentioning, understand what these anti-voting bills are and how to contact your federal representative about passing the federal voting rights protections that Dan was mentioning. You know, share your voter story, encourage other people to share their story. Fair Fight has this new national story collection, and they're collecting people's stories about their experience, you know, what was good about their voting experience, what was bad about the voting experience, to make, you know, our voices loud, to make our voices heard. And so, you know, this work is important, as it will highlight the dire need for what Dan just mentioned, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And then another thing, you know, for us who have access to our computers, you know, be communication ambassadors for what Fair Fight is supporting, or what they're providing via social media posts and articles. You know, these sources are full of voter empowerment and educational information on what is at stake for voter suppression efforts that are taking place in Georgia. And then one thing, you know, I did over the weekend, it was our John Lewis Voting Rights Action Day. Whew, say that 5 times fast. But we, you know, did a voter motorcade, if you will. We gathered in one place. We decorated our cars in support of, you know, this Voting Rights Advancement Act. We tooted our horns through the neighborhood. We talked to people who were standing in the streets. You know, not everybody has access to the internet. Go out where you can, you know, talk to people and talk about what they're experiencing. You know, we went from, you know, I'm 15 miles outside of Atlanta. We started there, drove to a location, and then we continued into Atlanta to be loud and proud about our support for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So there are different ways that you can get involved. And now those are just some of the things that I'm doing through my continued work through Fair Fight.
Those are, and I really don't have much to add to those. I agree with all of what Tanya and Alex said. The only thing I'll add is bolstering election officials. One of the things that we saw, these folks got targeted in a really terrible way. And one of the, we're going to be releasing a new report just about, you know, ensuring the safety of election officials, and then the longer term issue, which is less dire and immediate, but also is the funding. So if you, whatever a state does, if you take folks at their word of saying they want to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, or whatever pablum they come up with, Well, okay, make it easier to vote. Like fund your election officials to ensure that, you know, there actually is voting access. And some of the more pernicious things that we're seeing, I know in Georgia, is also is these efforts to take over local election boards, you know, and so that is something that's hard to legislate against at a federal level. Not impossible, but hard. So like there's a lot to do to just bolster the folks. I mean, and that was one of the great good stories about it, is how many election officials did their jobs, including a lot of Republicans, and supporting those folks, I think, is really critical.
Thank you all. My next question comes from Rebecca Fleischman. She said in yesterday's session, we learned about how disinformation is wielded online to change the outcome of elections. Do you expect to see more disinformation campaigns on how to vote? And the examples that you provided are sort of false or misleading information on voting requirements that will be targeted at the BIPOC community. Alex or Tanya, do you want to kick that answer off?
Yes, there will be a lot. I mean, it depends whether or not our platforms step up and actually do their jobs in, you know, not being, you know, propaganda centers, in my opinion. You know, there is a lot of disinformation. It will continue. It will continue in a variety of different ways. It will morph. It becomes institutionalized, and Dan mentioned the funding. You know, many states got private grants to help manage elections, and now states have made getting those private grants illegal. Arizona just did it. Georgia did it. There are other bills around the country where foundation grants are now off limits for election officials in terms of helping them administer elections. And that was done specifically because there was money funded to fight disinformation. As a matter of fact, the sponsor of the bill that got that prohibition in Arizona was kicked off a platform for running a troll farm using high school students. That was the patron of the bill, right? That's the place we're at in the United States right now. That's the place our democracy is at. And there are people in state legislatures who are actively undermining our democracy. And we need to be very vigilant. And I don't want to be alarmist, but I am alarmed because I think it is different in kind. You know, we opened a door. We always had, our elections were sacrosanct at some level, like we trusted them. And we didn't always like the outcome, but we had a system to ensure that we pretty much trusted them, right? And there were some rare exceptions where we weren't so sure, but generally we trusted them. We're now creating a system where we will never be able to trust them again unless we put the brakes on it, unless we actually have people stand up and speak out against this push. And so I do think it's, you know, there were a lot of grassroots people that were engaged last cycle. I think we can re-engage those people. I think we can keep those people engaged on the kinds of like election administration things that I was just talking about. There are people that want to, like, they're hungry to be able to, like, what can I do? What can I continue to do? And I think that's what we need to support, that kind of like grassroots engagement, you know, with grass top support that says we can continue to be active forces and voices in our community for how our elections are administered and how they're run, because we know that our community needs will never be heard unless we have fair elections, right? And, you know, every state now has activated community groups that know that, but they turn away from democracy because our funders turn away from, because the funders turn away from democracy, right? And they're focused on other things. And the funders need to stay in this space now and stay in through 2024, or we may not have quite the same democracy that we have today.
Thank you, Alex. My mute button is on strong today, so I'm sorry about that. It's like strong, it's part of the conversation. But one of the things that I just wanted to mention was, like, you know, the silencing of one of our largest counties, here in Georgia. In Fulton County, now it is like 529 some odd square miles, and there are now going to be just 8 drop boxes that are spread across this 529-mile stretch. And so, that's about 1 for every 100,000 registered voters. So we're down to like 38 drop boxes that were previously available to voters. And so, a lot of Fulton County residents are feeling like they're going to be silenced because they don't have that greater access to those ballot boxes. So, just from talking to some of the people in the community, I'm hearing that they're feeling like they're going to be silenced. It's not going to be really easy, and they're becoming a little disheartened, but they still want to be a part of this democracy process. So thank you for kicking that off, Alex.
The one other thing I'll just say is that, we've been talking a lot about this federal legislation. There is a lot of this depends on what the response is to disinformation. And the For the People Act has actually a pretty powerful response. It was a separate bill called the Deceptive Practices in Voter Intimidation Prevention Act. And one of the things is that our laws against disinformation targeting voters are sort of a patchwork. And so the kinds of things the questioner asked about, literally saying, don't forget to vote on Wednesday, or, that sort of thing. Generally, you can't prohibit speech, right, under the First Amendment, but actually lies designed to dissuade people from voting can be prohibited. And this bill would create a federal prohibition, and it would also require the federal government to take more active steps to prevent disinformation like that. So part of it, again, is going to be how forceful a response do you get from the federal government and from state officials to the problem of disinformation, which I agree, and I really do agree with Tanya, is because this other stuff is already disheartening, is going to be a really acute challenge that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to read our next question. It's coming from Aaron Gorin Van Alsten. Aaron wants to know, voter suppression seems to be a core Trumpism and a very partisan issue. It's also been said that For the People Act is a partisan power grab. Can you talk about why it is in everyone's best interest?
I can go first with that. I think this partisan power grab meme, which we saw actually was very much on display. The Senate held a hearing yesterday on the For the People Act, and all, Senator McConnell, Senator Cruz, they all lined up. And that is the sort of talking point they've latched onto. And I think it's pernicious and harmful. I do think you have to remember that virtually everything in the For the People Act has extremely strong bipartisan support. Every poll they do that shows overwhelming numbers of Republicans actually support the For the People Act. And these key provisions, so automatic voter registration, passed the Illinois legislature unanimously. Got 2/3 of the vote in Michigan when it was on a ballot referendum. The vast majority of states have early voting. Many states, I think, have no excuse absentee voting or mail voting, as it were. And Republicans historically have used these ways of voting as much as Democrats. I think it's sort of regrettable, actually, that when white, older, more conservative voters were voting by mail, it was great, wonderful, isn't this wonderful, we're making it more convenient. When people of color start to use these same tools, of course, then all of a sudden we're worried about voter fraud. That's, I guess, the thing that we struggle against. But the reality is these have strong bipartisan support. The last time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized before Shelby County, it got unanimous support in the Senate, and George W. Bush signed it into law. So I think that the notion that this is some sort of partisan power grab that'll benefit the Democratic Party is just, baseless, utterly. And I think that there's, a gazillion data points you can cite to say why that's not the case.
Going back to our questions here, we have a question that came in, and Tom wants to know, how do we rebuild the trust in our election systems? Because even if voting rights are strengthened, how can we ensure that the people and political institutions will actually accept the results?
We need politicians that tell the truth, right? It's that simple. It's like, it really is. It's like, I testified a number of times for the Arizona legislature, and I started my soliloquy almost every time. We have yet another bill premised upon lies and conspiracy theories, okay? And it's like, we should legislate based on facts, right? The reason we have legislative hearings is to gather data about like what would in fact make better laws. And as far as elections go, we have now come to legislating back based on lies and conspiracy theories. And I mean, whatever, if you just look at what's going on in the news with the leadership of the Republican Party, I don't want to like personalize it, but they're having a big fight about like whether or not truth should prevail. And that's where our country's at. We're, one of our major parties is trying to decide whether truth should in fact prevail. And I think truth should prevail. And in many of these things, not all of these things, but many of these things get better if we use fact and data-driven policies, if we use evidence-based practices, if we commit ourselves to running government that way, then I think we're in a much better position. Because if we use fact-based, data-driven decisions about elections, we make them fairer and they are more inclusive. And that's all we're asking for, is for them to be inclusive of the people who can vote, are allowed to vote, and we set up systems that facilitate their voting.
Thank you, Alex. The next question for the panel is, how can individuals who live in more inclusive states help with this effort? Alex and Tanya, you have laid out some really unsettling things that are happening in your states, but in states where inclusivity is more accepted, what can we do to help with this effort?
I have a thought on that, but Tanya, you might be trying
to jump on in then, Dan.
So I'll just very quickly say that in terms of the fund, first of all, depending on where folks are, the funding for democracy work and stuff is hugely important. And Alex kind of touched on that. I will also say that the nature of what we're trying to accomplish right now in Washington is such that folks who live in other states should be urging their elected representatives to get this done. If you live in New York, you have a very important senator. If you live in Illinois, you have a very important senator. In addition to obviously offering support to grassroots networks and other in states where we know there are sort of swing senators, you should be conveying to your own elected leaders that this is a must-pass set of priorities. And absolutely, the Brennan Center is a C3. I am not saying this in a partisan way, but that conveying to whoever is your elected representative that this is a priority for you. Because actually, we see with democracy issues under the dome, as they say in Washington, oftentimes the conventional wisdom is that, people get polled and they say that how they feel about this, but, it's not actually a priority next to infrastructure or healthcare or whatever. And so my number one thing is demonstrating that is a priority. And that includes, you talked about more inclusive states, but also if you happen to have a Republican representing you, and they need to hear that message too. Obviously at the state level as well. It's not just at the
Yeah, I was, just to add on to what you said, Dan, you may not have a fair fight like we have here in Georgia, but that still doesn't prohibit you from fully understanding what these anti-voting bills look like, contacting your representative as well, just becoming more knowledgeable about it, and not just kind of scrolling through like, oh my God, this is just happening, and oh my goodness, and scroll on by. Like, click it, open it, read it. Sometimes it's 93 pages long. Sometimes there's a synopsis, but just fully understanding what that looks like, how it can affect, if it's not you, your friend or a coworker, just fully understanding those bills and getting involved in that way, I would say.
And our next question is for the entire panel. How can the environmental community harness our power to help the pro-democracy movement?
I would say be loud. One of the things, I talked about Moms Clean Air Force, how we, fight for justice in every breath. Let me tell you, when we do our main event that's in DC, the offices are like, oh my God, here come those people in those red shirts. And we're like, that's right, here we come. We want to know how you're fighting for our clean air. What policies are you putting in place to ensure that our children are going to be breathing fresh air in the future? I would say just be loud, even if it's, writing a letter, if it's calling the office, if it's setting meetings with their staff. Have the conversation. The people who represent you are supposed to be representing you and your interests. They are normal people. Sometimes they may not feel like it, but they're normal people. They want to talk to you. They want to hear from you. Some might not want to hear from you, but it's their job to hear from you. I would say be loud about your concerns. Involve other people, involve your family members, involve friends. Into these conversations that are going to protect you and the environment. It's your environment. Fight for it. Be loud.
Say the environmental movement and community just has extraordinary moral authority when it chooses to lend that authority to an issue. It is heard loud and clear. Again, democracy is great, but it is also sort of abstract. And so these issues, and that's not just true for voting, it's also true for money and politics, for all of these issues that have an impact on the environment, that, when you concretize it for people, it transforms their outlook. So I think and this has happened to a great extent already, the environmental movement really going all in on that you can't fix the environment unless you also fix your democracy is a game changer. And continuing to do that, I think, just has tremendous power. And so, like Tanya said, using that moral authority to argue for this, which I think is necessary to advance the goals of the environmental.
I would just add, you have like extraordinary foot power, right? You have like people who get out. And so connecting with democracy groups so that, folks that are doing democracy advocacy connect with the power of the power that your members have in just in terms of activation. I think that's one of the things we need to make happen, is just make that connection so that we can then harness that power, get those grassroots organizations really focused on these democracy issues and how they implement at the local level.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and exploring issues around voting access. And I want to give a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists, Tanya, Alex, and Dan. This has been a great conversation, and we thank you for sharing all of your insights and knowledge with us, and for also going out there and creating some good trouble. We know our voice in this fight is important to the democracy movement, and it's deeply connected to our goals of making real and lasting climate progress. If you have a question today that didn't get answered during the event, please email us at events@edf.org, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. Again, thank all of you. Have a wonderful day, and let's all go out there and create some good trouble. Thank you.